So although I have to say that Season 1 of Diablo 4 wasn't what a lot of players were expecting or wanting it to be, this might actually be the only opportunity in Season that we're able to see such a ridiculous, pretty much overpowered and fun Sorcerer build for PvP. And thanks to the effects of the limited time only Omnipower Sorcerer specific Malignant Heart, and a very specific setup with Chain Lightning, it is actually possible to shoot out up to 6 Chain Lightnings with one cast, allowing you to one-shot most players and also within one Frost Nova freeze or one stun from your Raiment of the Infinite teleportation. And in general, you don't actually need necessarily the best gear for this build to work in PvP. Plus, combined with the recent buffs that Sorcerers got all around, they're actually now a strong contender in the Fields of Hatred regardless. And with that, going into the details of this build, this is again a Chain Lightning Sorcerer build focused on very high burst damage with the Omnipower Malignant Heart. Although the Barber Heart would probably be viable as well, although not as ideal, the build also features several ways of locking your enemy down, not only with Frost Nova, but again with Teleport if you have the unique chest, the Raiment of the Infinite, and also ways to reduce the cooldowns on both of these skills so then you can, again, lock down your opponents more to be able to blast them in the face with your Chain Lightning multicasts. Also, I found that this build has decent survivability with all the barriers you have available to you and also immunity with Flame Shield, as well as some of the skill and Paragon choices that we can make. And diving into the itemization, my first goal is to have as much burst damage as I can. And to achieve this, you would want the lowest mana roll on the Omnipower Heart. Ideally, you'd want 35, which is the best roll. And the reason for this is that Chain Lightning happens to cost 35 mana. And with the Heart being a 35 mana roll, that means whenever you cast a single Chain Lightning, it'll trigger Omnipower to allow you to shoot as many Chain Lightnings as your mana pool allows. So with that, the second piece to achieving the highest amount of burst that you can is to have a high enough mana pool to shoot out up to 5 Chain Lightnings with that single trigger. And just doing a bit of number crunching, we'll find that you actually need 175 at least mana to be able to cast 5 Chain Lightnings with a single cast with Omnipower, and actually a 6th Chain Lightning if you use the Chain Lightning Enchantment in your passives. To achieve that, you not only need a very specific Paragon configuration, and I'll link that exact build in the description box below for your reference, a Maxroll build, but besides that, you also need mana or plus maximum mana on specific pieces of gear, namely your helmet. You want as high of a mana roll as possible, and then on usually both rings, you also want plus mana. So that covers the maximum mana portion. Next, for your general gear, starting with defenses, my original idea when creating the Sorcerer was actually to stack as many defensive aspects and stats as I could, with things like the Snow Veiled aspect, as you can see here, as well as Ever Living aspect or Mage Lord's aspect, on top of also using Disobedience, which I'm actually still using for PvP. But after testing it out, I've actually since changed my playstyle to more of a stun and burst type playstyle, because especially against classes that have sustain like the Druid and Rogue, you really want to just have the most burst damage and CC cooldowns as possible. So I actually now think the Frost Blitz aspect for an extra Frost Nova charge would actually be preferred for you to have just a greater number of Frost Novas to be able to burst down your enemies more effectively. And of course, this combined with the Raiment of the Infinite will allow your teleport to also stun enemies. And even just with Disobedience as my main defensive aspect, I found that my Sorcerer is still quite tanky, especially with both Ice Barrier and Flame Shield being available. And for the rest of the gear, namely the offensive pieces and aspects and the affixes to go for, you can definitely refer to my Maxroll character template link below. So I'm not really going to go through each and every one of these, as these are pretty standard Chain Lightning aspects that you'll be using. But again, for affixes, you'll mostly want critical strike chance and critical strike damage, as well as lightning critical strike damage being a possible role for sorcerers, of course. And then you also want, if you're playing with Omnipower, Lucky Hit to generate primary resource on your offhand and your gloves, which is actually a really good stat for this build, combined with getting some Lucky Hit from your skill tree and perhaps your gear as well from your wand if you're using a wand, because this is quite a mana hungry build. And another reason that having more mana and mana regeneration is important is that if you have above 100 mana, you'll be able to get 40 up to 40 additional critical strike chance with the Elementalist aspect, which is actually a huge DPS increase, right? Especially again if you're shooting off 5 or 6 chain lightnings simultaneously. And for that reason, and just to have more mana regeneration again in general, the recharging aspect is going to be likely one of your endgame chases to get a high roll on that aspect, which will make a world of difference. And moving on to Malignant hearts really quick, again, your main heart, the Wrathful or Black heart that you want to be using is Omnipower, although the Barber likely will not be too bad either, although you will just have to change some of the parts of your gear, including not having to have that much max mana, right, if you're going to be using the Barber. Next, for a blue socket, I like to use the Heart of Revenge for some consistent damage reduction, and I prefer this over the Cage Heart of Spellbreaking, which although has up to higher damage reduction, actually doesn't trigger until you first take one instance of damage, right? So that first bit of damage that you take to trigger it will not actually have that damage reduction, which is why again I prefer the Cage Heart of Revenge. And next, for an orange socket, I like to have the Caged Heart of Talrasha for some consistent damage. Although the Caged Heart of Tempting Fate, since you'll be critting so much, or rather your critical strike chance is so darn high, with the right gear of course, that might actually be a strong contender, if not better, so I might have to test that one out. Moving on to skills in Paragon, a lot of it is just standard chain lightning, although there is some room for personal preference. So again, first of all, you want Firebolt for the enchantment slot to benefit from burning enemies' affixes. For Chain Lightning, you would want Greater Chain Lightning for additional damage, and then depending on how much max mana you have in your items, you can actually take more points in Devastation here. And then I think for the rest of the tree, it's pretty self-explanatory. You just want to take passive damage where you can. You want to take the so-called trifecta or quadfecta of useful defensive skills, Flame Shield, Teleport. You can actually put more points into Teleport if you want. I like 1 point in Ice Barrier because on my Amulet currently I don't have the plus skills to defensive skills. If you have the Amulet affix to just +2 defensive skills, you don't necessarily need to put any points into Ice Armor at all actually. And then of course I like to max Frost Nova for a lower cooldown. And then I think the rest is again pretty self-explanatory. Devouring Blaze is key here. You want to max it out and also take up to 3 points on your Amulet. You want to find that for some good DPS increase. And then Unstable Currents, I think it's optional, but I like having it for a little bit of extra burst because there's a chance for you to cast additional lightning spells, including Chain Lightnings when you have it up. Then for the key passive, I like having Veer's Mastery. And again, for more details, feel free to check out my Maxroll link below, including of course my Paragon setup. And just note that if you don't have a good roll on Omnipower or don't have the heart or prefer to use the Barber, you don't have to then take as many of the max mana nodes on your Paragon and skill tree and your gear. And going over enchantments, I personally prefer Chain Lightning and Firebolt, although some other viable options to replace Chain Lightning with would be something like Teleport to replace your dodge with another Teleport for an additional stun. You can also use Flame Shield for sort of a death prevention mechanic, although I found that it's not that useful because it's more like a lose more mechanic if you're going to lose anyway. But some other options can perhaps include Ice Blades if you decide to go for like more vulnerable uptime, but I don't think it's that great. So I think stick with the aforementioned ones, mainly again Teleport, Chain Lightning, or Flame Shield in my opinion. And for a quick tip, I also wanted to touch on potions really quick, and actually more specifically the non-craftable potions that you can get from Hell Tides. I think only Hell Tides. Opening the mystery chest will sometimes give you like really powerful potions like the lucky hit chance one, the increased critical chance one if you don't yet have that much critical strike chance, or even the increased critical strike damage. Again, I prefer the burst damage, but I think getting the max health potion is also going to be really powerful. And also the Iron Skin Elixir is extremely good. I probably like this one the most because it gives you 900 armor. Another good one is the Curative Elixir. This one you can actually craft and you just need to do a side quest easily in Kyrgyzstan. You pick it up from Giyakul, the capital city of Kyrgyzstan, and this will actually reduce the duration of damage over time effects, mainly poison effects when you're going up against certain rogues. And last but not least, I also wanted to go through some general PvP strategies and tips for the Omnipower Chain Lightning Sorcerer. And first, you definitely want to mark yourself for blood. So you're actually able to get the jump on someone, right? Because that's actually really important for this build. For example, to be able to teleport on someone to stun them, and then perhaps follow that up with a Frost Nova, which will also turn them vulnerable and then freeze them, assuming they're not unstoppable. And then after which you can promptly burst them down with Chain Lightning. That is the general rotation. Again, you want to be really close to the enemy for most, if not all, of your Chain Lightnings to land. And sometimes it's actually better to rotate your stuns between Chain Lightning and Frost Nova. I found that sometimes if I follow my Raiment stun from teleport immediately with the Frost Nova, I would have wasted one of the stuns because the opponent would have an Unstoppable to get out of it. So rather than doing that, you can stun them first, bait out their Unstoppable, and then just run over and use your Frost Nova manually, or use your spacebar if you have the enchantment with teleport to stun them again, and then promptly Frost Nova them and then kill them like that. I found that especially against better players and similarly geared players, the battles often become a trading of cooldowns. So again, you really want to manage them carefully and also be able to dodge out of or unstoppable or even immune with Flame Shield your opponent's cooldowns, right? So what I like to have is Flame Shield to be able to get out of situations like opponent stuns and Frost Novas. Previously I was using the aspect where my Ice Barrier was also granting me Unstoppable, but I'm thinking to change that to, again, the double Frost Nova charge. So that will require some testing or even a gear swap depending on the opponent I go up against. And another thing to be really wary of, and I've actually made a ton of mistakes here in this duel by not doing that, but you actually want to manage your mana extremely carefully as well. You generally don't want to cast Chain Lightning unless you're like right in front of your opponent, and preferably if they're stunned or trying to get up close to you to kill you, but you happen to have Ice Barrier and or Flame Shield up to be able to tank that while blasting them in the face with Chain Lightning. Again, with Omnipower, mana management becomes really important because if you miss, you generally have to wait a few seconds before your mana goes up to an amount where you can actually cast your multi-Chain Lightnings again, right? So there can be sort of some kiting involved if you happen to miss your Chain Lightning, if your opponent, say, uses Concealment if they're a Rogue, or Teleport if they're a Sorcerer, or Blood Mist if they're a Necromancer to escape from your CC. And lastly, a sort of weakness of this build is that if your opponent knows that you are an Omnipower Sorcerer, there are actually ways to play around it, right? Notably, playing against and around the weakness of this build, which is mana hunger and just having one shot basically to kill your opponent, right? If your opponent saves their cooldown specifically for when you try to use your Omnipower Chain Lightnings, they can definitely dodge out of or avoid the brunt of your damage, like how I'm fighting this rogue here. They basically try to kite me out, make me pop my cooldowns while using their own cooldowns like Concealment to escape, and then just using their poison to whittle me down and just having me die as a sitting duck pretty much. This build is definitely not foolproof, especially against more overpowered, I guess, characters like really decked out rogues with poison, but it's certainly a ton of fun and it's still very powerful and viable for sure. I definitely had a lot of success with it, although my win rate is not 100% as you can see here, but I'm definitely trying more things and getting better at this build and also learning how some of the other classes play, which will hopefully improve my win rate as well. And that is pretty much all for my build guide for the PvP Omnipower Lightning Sorcerers. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Be sure to drop it a like if you did, and also of course check out my detailed Maxroll guide in the description box below, and comment as well if you have any questions. And with that, I will catch you next time. Peace.